The town of Red River was alive that spring morning, though not with the joy she had once dreamed of. Bells should have been ringing, wagons decorated, and neighbors dressed in their Sunday best. Instead, hushed whispers followed every step of Sarah Whitfield as she walked down the dirt street in her plain blue dress, her veil crumpled in her trembling hands. Just yesterday, she had been a bride-to-be. Today, she was the town's newest scandal. Poor girl, some muttered. Can't keep a man. Others were less kind. He saw sense before it was too late. Sarah kept her chin high, but each word lodged in her chest like a burr. Her fiancé, Daniel Price, had called off the wedding an hour before it was to begin. His reason had been sharp and cruel. I can't do it, Sarah. You're not the woman I thought I wanted. No man wants a wife who has nothing to offer but her quiet ways and plain face. She had stared at him in disbelief, her heart breaking with every syllable. She wasn't beautiful like her sister, nor lively like the other town girls. But she had thought kindness and loyalty were enough. She had thought she was enough. Now, she knew she wasn't, at least not in the eyes of the men around her. At 24, she was considered nearly a spinster by frontier standards. Families whispered she was cursed, a woman meant for no man. The humiliation was unbearable. Even her own mother, while sympathetic, urged her not to cry in public. Dignity. Sarah, don't give them more to talk about. But what was left of dignity when the entire town had seen her waiting at the church, only to walk away alone? That night, she lay awake in her small room above her father's store, staring at the ceiling while laughter from the saloon drifted through the window. She replayed Daniel's words over and over until they carved themselves into her bones. No man wants me. In the quiet, she realized she could not stay in Red River. The town was too small, its people too cruel. Every glance, every whisper would be a reminder of her failure. The four walls that had once been her refuge now pressed in like a cage. She rose before dawn, her movements swift and sure. If she stayed, she would wither into the bitter, forgotten woman townsfolk already believed her to be. But if she left, perhaps somewhere beyond the prairie, she could carve a life of her own. She packed a small satchel, a few dresses, her father's worn Bible, and the sewing kit her mother had given her at 16. She tucked away the last of her savings, barely enough for a few days' supplies, and tied her shawl tight against the morning chill. Before leaving, she paused by her mirror. The face that stared back was pale, the eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. Plain yes, as everyone said. But beneath the weariness was a spark, something she hadn't noticed before. Perhaps strength, perhaps desperation. Maybe both. When she stepped onto the dirt road outside town, the world seemed bigger than it ever had. The prairie stretched endlessly, golden under the rising sun. A few wagons rattled toward market, and an old man tipped his hat at her, pity etched in his gaze. She walked past without looking back. Her heart was heavy, but her feet carried her onward. Each step away from Red River was a step away from shame, from Daniel, from the words that had haunted her. She did not yet know where she was going, only that she must go. The wilderness held dangers, Indians, outlaws, starvation, but it also held freedom. And for a woman who believed no man wanted her, freedom was the only promise left worth chasing. Thus began her journey into the wild, where fate had something waiting she could never have imagined. A fate not of pity nor rejection, but of belonging. The prairie stretched endlessly before Sarah, a vast sea of gold and green swaying under the sun. She had walked for hours, leaving Red River behind, the town's memory fading but never fully disappearing. Every gust of wind whispered her failures. Every crow that cawed overhead reminded her of the judgment she carried. Still, she pressed on. She had no destination, only the fierce determination not to return to a life where she was unwanted. By midday, the sun bore down relentlessly. Her shoes, worn thin from her hurried departure, allowed the rough dirt to bite at her heels. She paused to catch her breath near a dry creek bed, the parched ground cracking under her fingers. Water was scarce, and the little she had brought was nearly gone. Hunger gnawed at her stomach like a persistent animal. She had underestimated the wilderness dot as the shadows lengthened. Sarah realized that survival was not as simple as walking away from her problems. The prairie, though beautiful, was indifferent to human suffering. She scanned the horizon for signs of shelter or habitation, but all she saw were rolling hills and the occasional lone tree. Even the birds seemed distant and unhelpful, flying in silent arcs above her head. She pressed on, moving toward a faint rise in the distance. Her legs ached, her shoulders burned, and sweat streaked her pale face, but she could not stop. She had no one to turn to, and she feared that if she faltered, the town she had fled might still catch up with her, if not Daniel. Then the cruel gossip that trailed her name Dot as night began to fall, the prairie changed. Shadows grew long, and strange sounds filled the air, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant howl of wolves, and the whisper of the wind through dry grass. Sarah's heart raced. She knew she was vulnerable. Alone in the wilderness, any mistake could be fatal. She tried to build a small fire, rubbing 2 sticks together, but her trembling hands and lack of experience thwarted her efforts. Cold seeped into her bones as darkness enveloped the land. She wrapped herself in her shawl and huddled against a rock, listening to the night. Every crack of a branch made her flinch. Every movement in the tall grass seemed like a predator waiting to strike. Sleep eluded her. Hunger and fear merged into a single, gnawing presence. She thought of Red River and the life she had left behind the ridicule, the heartbreak, the loneliness, but also the warmth of familiar walls and the security of known faces. And yet she could not return. Not after the humiliation. Not after Daniel had shattered her trust in men. Hours passed. Exhausted and near despair, she considered giving up, letting herself collapse into the earth. But just as she was about to sink into hopelessness, she heard it, the faint sound of hooves in the distance, steady and deliberate. Her pulse quickened. Could it be danger, another threat, or perhaps salvation? A figure emerged on the horizon, mounted on a horse. At first, she could make out little only a shadow against the moonlight. But as he drew closer, she saw the strong features, the alert eyes, the wary stance of a man accustomed to the wilderness. Her fear sharpened. She froze, unsure whether to run or plead. The rider stopped a few yards away. He was unlike anyone she had ever seen, his skin bronzed by the sun, his movements precise and calm, his gaze steady yet cautious. Without a word, he dismounted and approached her slowly, assessing, measuring. Sarah's first instinct was to retreat, but her body betrayed her, heavy with exhaustion and weakness. The stranger extended a hand, not in threat, but in aid. Sarah hesitated then. With nothing left to lose, she accepted it. He offered water from a canteen, and she drank greedily, quenching her thirst as he watched silently, protective yet distant Dot in that moment. Sarah realized something she had not understood until now. She was not completely alone. Not in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Not any more Dot, and though she did not yet know his name, she felt the first spark of hope, a fragile, trembling ember that promised safety, shelter, and perhaps in time, trust. Her desperate escape had brought her far from Red River, farther than she had ever imagined. But it had also brought her to him, an Apache warrior who would unknowingly change the course of her life forever. Dawn painted the prairie in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows over the rolling hills. Sarah awoke wrapped in a blanket that wasn't hers, the taste of yesterday's water still lingering on her lips. She blinked against the morning sun, trying to remember where she was. The stranger, The man who had appeared out of the night like a guardian angel was nowhere in sight. Her heart thumped. Had he left? A rustle in the tall grass drew her attention. She held her breath. The figure emerged again, walking with the ease of someone completely at home in the wilderness. As he came closer, she noticed the subtle details. His hair, dark and long, tied at the back. The lines of his face hardened by sun and wind. The quiet strength in his posture. He was an Apache, unmistakably, and unlike anyone Sarah had ever encountered. He stopped a few feet away, crouching slightly as if acknowledging the unspoken tension between them. Sarah's instincts screamed at her to flee, but exhaustion and curiosity rooted her to the spot. The Apache's gaze was steady, not threatening, yet there was an intensity that made her feel small, exposed, and oddly safe all at once. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. She tried to keep it calm, though her heart raced like a runaway horse. He said nothing, only studied her, his dark eyes thoughtful. She realized he might not speak English, or perhaps he did, but chose silence. The stillness of the prairie seemed to stretch on, the air between them alive with unspoken understanding. Finally, he reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small bundle of dried meat and water, setting it down in front of her. She looked at him, hesitant, then at the food, and slowly understood. He was offering her sustenance. Relief flooded her. She sank to her knees and ate ravenously, drinking the water as though it would bring her back to life. As she ate, she noticed the careful way he watched her. There was no judgment in his gaze, no mockery, only awareness. In a world that had scorned her, that had labeled her undesirable, here was someone who saw her need without question. Someone who responded not with cruelty, but with action. When she finished, he gestured toward a small rise nearby where a modest shelter made of branches and hides stood. It wasn't much, but it offered shade and protection from the elements. Hesitant yet trusting, she followed him, stepping carefully over roots and stones. Once inside, he handed her a cloth to wipe her face and hands. She took it, feeling an odd warmth in the gesture. This man, a complete stranger from a world she barely understood, treated her with a respect she had never known. He spoke softly in his language, words flowing like music she didn't understand, but somehow felt. His tone was gentle, patient, almost comforting. Sarah realized she had expected danger, perhaps even hostility. After all, she had been taught to fear strangers, to distrust the unfamiliar. Yet here was a man who defied every expectation. He didn't ask her name, didn't demand anything from her. He simply provided what she needed, over the hours. She watched him as he moved about the camp, gathering water from a nearby stream, tending a small fire, and checking the traps he had set the day before. There was an elegance in his movements, a rhythm that spoke of experience, survival, and a life deeply connected to the land. By midday, a fragile trust had begun to form. Sarah felt a flicker of hope she hadn't felt since leaving Red River. Perhaps, just perhaps, she had found a protector in the unlikeliest of places. A man who did not see her as plain or unwanted, but simply as someone who needed help. As the sun climbed higher, warming the earth beneath their feet, Sarah knew one thing for certain: her life had changed forever. The wilderness, which had seemed so terrifying, was now a place of refuge. And the Apache warrior, who had appeared as if from the wind itself, was the key to that safety. She didn't yet know what lay ahead, but for the first time in months, fear was tempered by a fragile, glimmering sense of hope. And that, she realized, was enough to keep her moving forward. The shelter was modest, a small structure of branches and animal hides that blended seamlessly into the rolling prairie. Sarah stepped inside, taking in her surroundings with cautious curiosity. The floor was lined with dry grass, and a small fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by stones blackened with soot. It smelled faintly of smoke and earth, a comforting scent in the vast emptiness of the wilderness. The Apache warrior motioned for her to sit near the fire. She obeyed, settling on the soft bedding he had laid out. The movement felt strange, almost ceremonial, as if she had entered a space that existed outside of time, where the world of townsfolk and ridicule had no meaning. Here, in the quiet of his shelter, she felt for the first time a kind of safety she hadn't known she could have. He moved around the shelter with an ease that spoke of years spent in the wilderness. He added kindling to the fire, checked the small traps nearby, and inspected a bundle of herbs and roots he had collected earlier. Every motion was precise, purposeful, and deliberate, as if the land itself dictated his every action. Sarah watched him, fascinated, a mixture of awe and caution in her eyes. Finally, he gestured toward a small pile of food he had prepared. Bread, dried meat, and some berries, simple, nourishing, and offered without expectation. Sarah accepted it gratefully, her hands shaking slightly as she ate. He watched silently, his gaze steady, not prying but fully aware of her presence. It was then she realized something remarkable. He treated her not as an intruder, nor as a burden, but as a guest deserving of care. No one in Red River had ever looked at her this way. No man had ever offered her kindness without judgment. Here, in this simple shelter, she felt seen for the first time, not for her looks, not for her social standing, but for her very existence. The afternoon passed in quiet companionship. The Apache warrior worked near the fire, sharpening tools, mending clothes, and tending to his small traps, while Sarah explored the edges of the shelter, learning the small rhythms of survival in his world. Though they spoke little, the language of gestures, glances, and shared tasks created a bridge between them. At one point, he held out his hand, palm open, indicating the nearby stream. She understood instantly and followed him to the water's edge. The cool stream ran clear and fast, and as she drank, she felt a relief that went beyond quenching thirst. It was the relief of knowing she could rely on him, at least for this moment, to guide her, protect her. Returning to the shelter, she began to ask questions, not in words, for she suspected he might not understand, but in simple gestures, pointing at his tools, mimicking actions, showing curiosity about the life he led. He responded patiently, demonstrating how to use the tools, how to gather herbs, and even how to build a fire without letting it flare dangerously. Sarah realized that this was more than simple survival. It was a lesson in trust, in cooperation, and in understanding a world vastly different from the one she had left behind. And yet, there was a subtle intimacy in it, a closeness born not of romance but of shared vulnerability. Both were outsiders in their own ways, she, rejected by society. He, living apart from the settlers who feared and misunderstood him. As dusk approached, he motioned for her to rest while he maintained the fire. Sarah lay down, her body sore but her mind buzzing with the day's lessons. She felt a flicker of something she had thought impossible, hope. Not the hollow hope of returning to a town that had scorned her, but a genuine, fragile hope that perhaps a life beyond shame and rejection was possible. The night came softly, the prairie settling into quiet. Through the small opening in the shelter, she could see the stars emerge, one by one, like distant promises. She realized that for the first time, she wasn't alone. The Apache warrior, enigmatic and watchful, had given her something that no one in Red River ever could: refuge, protection, and a sense that she mattered. And as she drifted into a weary sleep, Sarah knew that her journey had only begun, and that the man who had taken her in would play a role in a life she could never have imagined. A life beyond rejection, beyond fear, beyond the town that had forsaken her. The following morning, the prairie awoke with a quiet hum. Birds called across the hills, the wind rippled through the tall grass, and the sun rose golden and unyielding over the horizon. Sarah stirred on her bed of grass and hides. Feeling the stiffness in her shoulders and legs from the previous day's travel and her newfound wilderness lessons, she glanced toward the fire, where the Apache warrior was already at work. He moved with a calm precision, adding kindling, checking traps, and gathering a small handful of wild herbs. Though their communication remained limited, Sarah realized she was beginning to understand him, not his words, but his presence, his rhythm, his unspoken intentions. She hesitated at first, unsure how to interact beyond simple gestures, but the need for connection pushed her forward. Carefully, she began mimicking some of his movements, arranging small twigs for kindling, cleaning her small tools, and even attempting to replicate the way he inspected the traps. He glanced her way, and for the first time, she thought she saw a hint of approval in his dark eyes. Hours passed with little spoken, yet a bond formed in the quiet acts of daily survival. Sarah learned to anticipate his movements, when he would need water, when he would pause to check the horizon, when he would adjust the fire. And he, in turn, began to observe her, how she handled herself with growing confidence. The way her hands carefully mimicked his techniques, the subtle determination in her eyes. It was in these moments of silent companionship that Sarah realized something remarkable. They did not need words to communicate. The exchange of glances, gestures, and shared effort created an understanding deeper than language. Each action was a conversation, each glance a sentence, each pause a paragraph. At midday, he gestured for her to sit near the stream while he worked on repairing a trap. She obeyed, crouching on the bank, watching the water ripple past her fingers. The world felt suspended, the only sounds the babble of the stream and the rustle of the grass. She felt safe here in a way she had never experienced in Red River. The judgment, the whispers, the ridicule, they were gone. All that mattered was the quiet rhythm of life on the prairie and the man who shared it with her. As the sun climbed higher, she began experimenting with her own small tasks, gathering firewood, arranging herbs, and even attempting to fashion a simple bowl from clay. He watched patiently, occasionally guiding her with a gentle gesture or a soft word in his language. Though she could not understand him fully, she sensed the meaning through tone and intent. It was an intimacy born not of romance, but of trust and mutual respect. In the quiet, Sarah reflected on how different this man was from anyone she had known. Daniel Price, her former fiancé, had dismissed her with a cruel sentence. The townspeople had mocked her. But here, in the vast wilderness, she was not judged for her appearance, her manners, or her past. She was judged only by her effort, her willingness to learn, and her ability to adapt. And in this space, she had valued that. As evening approached, the Apache warrior signaled for her to rest while he tended the fire and prepared food. She settled onto her bedding, watching him work with steady hands. In the glow of the firelight, she felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she did not feel entirely alone. She did not feel unwanted. The silent understanding between them deepened with every passing moment. Each act of care, each shared effort, wove a fragile yet unbreakable bond. Sarah began to realize that the warrior saw her differently than the world ever had. He saw her courage, her resilience, and her will to survive. And though words remained scarce, she understood that this connection mattered more than any conversation, more than any social approval, more than anything she had left behind in Red River. In the quiet, under the vast expanse of sky, two souls, both outsiders in their own ways, had found each other. And for Sarah, that understanding was the beginning of something she had never expected: hope, trust, and the possibility of belonging. Days turned into a rhythm, measured not by clocks or bells, but by the rising and setting sun, the calls of birds, and the flow of the nearby stream. Sarah began to understand the frontier in a way she never had in Red River. Life here was harsh, unforgiving, yet beautiful, a constant test of strength, patience, and observation. And through it all, she had the Apache warrior by her side, guiding, teaching, and silently protecting her. She learned to move lightly through the tall grass, careful of rattlesnakes and hidden dips in the land. She learned which berries were safe to eat, which herbs could soothe a wound, and how to identify the subtle tracks of rabbits, deer, and other creatures. Every day demanded attention. Every misstep brought lessons. But Sarah embraced it all with a determination that surprised even herself. The wilderness, once terrifying, became a canvas on which she could prove her resilience. The Apache warrior, whose name she had yet to learn, shared glimpses of his life through actions rather than words. His camp was simple but efficient. Traps were set with precision, fires kept just enough to cook and warm without drawing unwanted attention. He moved through the land with ease, speaking to it as though it were a living companion. Watching him, Sarah realized that survival on the frontier required more than skill. It required respect for the land, for its creatures, and for oneself. In return, she offered what she could. Her hands, skilled in sewing and mending from her life in Red River, became useful in repairing clothing, stitching together hides, and reinforcing the small shelter. She learned to carry water without spilling, to keep a fire steady, to store food safely. Each small contribution earned a nod, a glance, or the faintest trace of a smile. These gestures, simple yet meaningful, became their unspoken language of trust. One afternoon, as they worked side by side near the stream, the Apache warrior paused, studying the horizon. Sarah followed his gaze and saw a small herd of deer moving cautiously through the hills. Without a word, he motioned for her to stay low and quiet. She obeyed instinctively, marveling at the harmony of his movements, the unspoken connection he had with the land. The deer passed without incident, and he allowed her a small, approving glance. It was a lesson not only in survival but in observation, patience, and respect. Despite the hardships, there was an undeniable beauty in the frontier. The sunsets painted the sky in fiery reds and golds. The streams sparkled like ribbons of silver, and the nights were alive with stars that seemed impossibly close. Sarah began to feel a sense of wonder she had never known in Red River, where life had been confined to streets, shops, and shallow gossip. Here, every day was alive with possibility, every moment a test, every night a chance for reflection. But life on the frontier was not just about learning skills. Sarah began to understand the warrior himself, the quiet sadness behind his steady gaze, the strength tempered by loss, and the resilience born from survival. He had endured hardships she could scarcely imagine, yet he met each day with calm, measured action. In a way, they were mirrors of one another. Both outsiders, both misunderstood, both finding a place where they could belong, even if only in the silence of shared effort. Over time, the bond between them deepened. She no longer felt like an intruder in his world. He no longer seemed like a distant guardian. Their lives intertwined, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared labor, and an unspoken understanding. Sarah realized she was no longer simply surviving, she was thriving, growing stronger, braver, and more capable with each passing day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of purple and gold, Sarah stood beside him, watching the world stretch endlessly before them. For the first time in her life, she felt that she belonged somewhere, not because society had deemed her worthy, but because she had earned it through courage, trust, and a willingness to embrace the unknown. The frontier world was harsh, yes, but it was honest. And in its honesty, Sarah discovered a sense of home she had never imagined possible. Life in the wilderness had settled into a delicate rhythm, but Sarah soon discovered that the frontier's peace was fragile. Even as she grew accustomed to the daily routines of survival, whispers of danger lingered in the air, reminders that the world beyond their camp was rarely kind to outsiders. One morning, as she gathered herbs near the stream, Sarah noticed signs that unsettled her. Footprints in the soft mud too deliberate to belong to animals, too small to belong to the Apache warrior traced a path along the banks. Her heart quickened. She looked toward the horizon, the hills rolling endlessly under the bright sun, and wondered who else might be watching, judging, or even threatening them. It wasn't long before the tension became more concrete. Nearby settlers had begun noticing the presence of the Apache and the white woman in the wilderness. Rumors traveled faster than the wind, that she had been taken, that he had kidnapped her, that she was being hidden from the eyes of civilization. The town she had fled, Red River, murmured about her fate with fascination and disapproval. Some feared the warrior. Others pitied her, unaware that the reality was far different from their imagination. Sarah could feel the pressure mounting. She saw it in the way the warrior's posture stiffened whenever they approached the edges of the prairie near settlers' land. His eyes grew sharper, more alert, scanning the horizon for any sign of intrusion. His quiet patience transformed into cautious vigilance. And though he never spoke of it, she understood that their lives could be threatened at any moment. Within the Apache community, the tension was no less pronounced. Some of his people regarded Sarah's presence with suspicion. A white woman living among them was unprecedented, a challenge to the traditions and boundaries they had long maintained. Sarah sensed the unspoken judgments, the sideways glances, the whispered warnings, the questions she could not answer. She feared that her presence might bring conflict, even danger, to the man who had rescued her. Yet, despite the looming threat from both settlers and his own people, the warrior did not waver in his protection of her. Each obstacle, each hostile look or whispered comment only seemed to reinforce his resolve. He demonstrated through action, not words, that her safety and well-being mattered above all else. And Sarah, in turn, learned to navigate these tensions carefully, to respect the delicate balance of their world, and to understand the courage it took to defend one's home and principles. Over time, these challenges brought them closer. Sarah observed how he handled threats not with anger, but with calculated strategy and calm authority. He taught her to recognize danger in subtle ways, the shift of a shadow, the sound of a horse's hooves from a distance, the unnatural silence of the prairie. In these lessons, she found not only survival skills but also a profound respect for his experience. Resilience and leadership. The tension, though palpable, revealed the depth of their trust. She learned to rely on his judgment, and he, in turn, began to trust her instincts and decisions. Their partnership became more than survival. It was an unspoken understanding of loyalty, courage, and mutual respect. Together, they navigated the delicate and often dangerous landscape of the frontier, balancing the threat of outsiders with the rhythms of wilderness life. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, Sarah realized how far they had come. The initial fear and uncertainty that had marked her arrival in the wilderness were now tempered by skill, knowledge, and connection. Though tension lingered, it no longer paralyzed her, it sharpened her senses, strengthened her resolve, and deepened her bond with the Apache warrior who had saved her life. In the face of both suspicion and potential danger, Sarah discovered the truth of the frontier. Life here was harsh, and trust was earned, not given. And in this place, amidst tension and uncertainty, she and the warrior had forged a partnership that could withstand the judgment of outsiders and the challenges of the wild. A partnership born of courage, necessity, and a quiet, unspoken understanding. The weeks passed with the steady rhythm of the wilderness. Yet Sarah could feel a subtle shift in the air between her and the Apache warrior. What had begun as cautious cooperation, tempered by necessity, was evolving into something deeper, more profound. She had learned the language of survival, the cadence of the land, and the unspoken gestures of trust. Now she sensed the beginnings of an emotional bond, one neither words nor society could define. It began in small moments. A glance shared across the fire as he handed her food, a protective gesture when she stepped near the edge of the stream, the way he allowed her to take the lead in small tasks without criticism. Each act was a quiet assertion of connection, a declaration that she mattered to him in ways the world had never acknowledged. Sarah, in turn, found herself watching him with growing admiration. She saw the subtle strength in his hands, the way he moved with purpose, and the patience with which he approached each task. But more than skill, it was the gentleness beneath his stern exterior that drew her. He had endured loss, hardship, and solitude, yet he still extended kindness and protection to her, a woman from a world that had rejected her. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the prairie, Sarah stumbled while gathering firewood. The warrior was instantly at her side, steadying her with a firm but careful hand. In that brief contact, something shifted. It was not just safety she felt, but warmth and intimacy that went beyond the physical. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, words seemed unnecessary. They were two souls, both scarred by life, recognizing in each other a reflection of strength, resilience, and a shared need for belonging. Over the following days, Sarah began to see herself through his eyes. She realized that in his presence, she was more than plain, unwanted, or dismissed. She was resourceful, capable, and alive. Every task she accomplished, every obstacle she overcame, reinforced the notion that she was valued not for her appearance or social standing, but for her courage and heart. The frontier, harsh and unyielding, had become a crucible for their bond. They faced dangers together, encounters with wild animals, the threat of hostile settlers, the scrutiny of his own people, and each challenge deepened their reliance on one another. It was in these trials that Sarah understood the depth of her feelings. She did not simply respect or admire him. She trusted him with her life, her fears, and her hopes. One evening, under the vast expanse of stars, Sarah finally allowed herself to acknowledge what she had felt for weeks. She could not return to Red River, not after the humiliation, not after the loneliness, and certainly not after experiencing the safety, respect, and connection she had found here. Her heart had chosen, and it had chosen him. The Apache warrior, sensing her resolve, gave a quiet nod. His eyes, dark and unwavering, seemed to convey understanding, acceptance, and a mirrored affection. There were no grand declarations, no speeches of love, only the unspoken acknowledgement that they had chosen each other. Despite the world, despite prejudice, despite the unknown. In that moment, Sarah felt a profound sense of belonging she had never known. The world that had rejected her Red River, Daniel Price, and the judgmental townsfolk felt distant, irrelevant, and almost unreal. Here, in the wilderness, among the rolling hills and whispering grass, she had found her place. Their choice was not without risk. The frontier remained unpredictable, and the tension from outsiders and cultural differences lingered. Yet the bond they had forged was stronger than fear, rumor, or danger. They had chosen each other, willingly and deliberately, and that choice became the foundation of a new life. As they sat by the fire that night, sharing the warmth of its glow, Sarah realized something extraordinary. Love was not always a declaration shouted to the world. Sometimes it was quiet, steadfast, and unyielding, growing in the spaces between survival and trust. And in that quiet, steadfast love, she had found a home she never expected but had always dreamed of. Life in the wilderness had settled into a fragile equilibrium, yet Sarah knew it could be disrupted at any moment. The bond she had formed with the Apache warrior was strong, but the world outside their sanctuary remained unforgiving. The whispers from settlers, the skepticism of his own people, and the distant pull of her past in Red River all lingered like shadows on the horizon. One morning, a rider appeared on a distant hill, dust rising from his horse's hooves. Sarah's heart clenched. The figure was unmistakably human, a messenger from the world she had left behind. As he approached, she could hear faint shouts, then the voice of a man calling her name. Panic surged through her chest. The town she had fled, the very place that had scorned her, was demanding her return. The Apache warrior moved with swift precision, positioning himself between her and the rider. His posture was calm but commanding, a silent declaration that he would not allow harm to come to her. Yet his eyes met hers, and she saw a question in them. How would she respond? The rider dismounted, a letter clutched in his hand, and spoke hurriedly. He claimed the town feared for her safety, that Daniel Price wanted reconciliation, and that her family insisted she return. Every word was laced with expectation, pressure, and subtle judgment. Sarah's stomach churned. Returning meant humiliation, shame, and the crushing weight of a life she had desperately tried to escape. Staying meant defying her past, risking conflict with both the settlers and his people, and placing her trust entirely in the warrior who had saved her. Her mind raced. She thought of the months she had spent in the wilderness, learning, surviving, and growing. She remembered the quiet understanding, the patience, and the protection she had received. She recalled the first moment she had realized she belonged here, not because of what she looked like or what she could offer, but because someone saw her for who she truly was. The warrior waited patiently, allowing her the space to choose. No words pressured her, no gesture demanded compliance. He simply stood there, a steady presence, a reminder that trust was built in actions, not commands. Sarah took a deep breath. She thought of the life she could reclaim in Red River, but it was a life of shadows, ridicule, and false expectations. She thought of Daniel Price, of his callous dismissal, and the crushing sense of inadequacy he had left behind. And then she looked at the warrior, the man who had taken her in, protected her, and allowed her to grow in ways she had never imagined. Her choice crystallized in that instant. She stepped forward, placing her hand lightly on his arm. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of her decision. She would stay. She would remain in the wilderness, with the man who had saved her, trusted her, and shown her a life of purpose, respect, and belonging. The rider, sensing the resolve in her eyes, bowed briefly and departed, leaving a whisper of disappointment in the wind. The tension eased, replaced by a profound relief. Sarah turned to the warrior, who offered a faint smile, a silent acknowledgment of her choice, their partnership, and the bond that had carried them through trials far greater than any letter or messenger could impose. That night, as the fire crackled and the prairie stretched endlessly around them, Sarah felt the magnitude of her decision. She had chosen not just a person, but a life beyond fear, judgment, and past failures. She had chosen loyalty, trust, and love over conformity, expectation, and shame. The test had been formidable, but it revealed the strength of their connection. In choosing him, she had embraced her own courage, autonomy, and sense of self. And in that choice, she discovered a freedom deeper than the wide prairie itself, a freedom born from love, trust, and the unwavering bond of two outsiders who had found each other against all odds. Sarah finally understood the essence of belonging. It was not dictated by towns, families, or societal norms. It was defined by loyalty, respect, and the courage to stand by those who truly saw you. And she had chosen that path unflinchingly. With the man who had changed her life forever, the prairie stretched endlessly beneath the rising sun, a vast expanse of gold and green that seemed to promise anything yet demanded everything. For Sarah, each morning now carried a sense of possibility that had been absent in Red River, where whispers, judgment, and rejection had defined her existence. Here, in the wilderness, she was not defined by her appearance or her past, but by her courage, resilience, and the bond she shared with the Apache warrior who had saved her life. Their days had settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and sacred. Together they hunted, gathered, repaired the shelter, and tended the small fire that was the heart of their home. The silence that had once been intimidating now felt comforting, a space in which they could exist without pretense, without expectation, and without fear. Words were no longer necessary. Their actions, glances, and shared efforts spoke volumes. Sarah often watched him as he moved through the prairie, the sunlight catching his dark hair, the strength in his hands evident in every deliberate movement. She had come to understand the depth of his experience, the pain he had endured, and the quiet courage that guided him through every challenge. And yet, what captivated her most was the gentleness beneath it all, the patient care, the protective instincts, the subtle ways he included her in his world without demanding submission or compliance. In turn, he had come to rely on her presence, her instincts, and her growing knowledge of the land. The partnership they shared was not one of dependence, but of mutual respect and understanding. Sarah realized that, for the first time in her life, she was an equal in someone else's world, valued for her abilities, her courage, and the strength of her heart. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky erupted in shades of crimson and violet, they sat together outside the shelter, listening to the whispering wind. Sarah felt a sense of completeness she had never known in Red River. The town, the gossip, the humiliation, all of it seemed distant, almost unreal. Here, surrounded by the endless prairie and the man who had chosen to share his life with her, she finally understood what it meant to belong. The warrior glanced at her, and for the first time, a soft smile touched his lips. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of love in words, only a profound acknowledgement in his eyes. It said, "You are safe. You are seen. You are home." Sarah reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. The warmth of that simple gesture carried the weight of everything they had endured together: fear, struggle, trust, and the quiet courage to defy a world that had rejected her. In that moment, she understood that love in the wilderness was not a dramatic display. It was steadfast, patient, and enduring. It was in the shared tasks, the protective gestures, the silent companionship, and the mutual respect that allowed two outsiders to thrive in a world that had once seemed so hostile. As night fell and stars began to pierce the dark velvet sky, Sarah leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. The prairie, vast and untamed, seemed less intimidating now, filled instead with the promise of life, growth, and possibility. They had chosen each other, defied the expectations of society, and created a life that belonged to them alone. In the weeks and months that followed, their bond only deepened. She became skilled in the ways of the land, and he continued to protect and guide her. The challenges of the frontier were many, but they faced them together, a partnership forged in trust and strengthened by love. Every day was a testament to their courage, resilience, and the decision to build a life beyond fear, judgment, and rejection. Sarah no longer thought of herself as the plain, unwanted girl from Red River. She was a survivor, a partner, and a woman who had discovered the true meaning of home, not a place, but a life shared with someone who saw her for who she truly was. And in that realization, she found a freedom, a peace, and a happiness she had never imagined possible. The prairie stretched on, vast and eternal, but for Sarah and the Apache warrior, it was no longer a wilderness to fear. It was a world of their own making, a life forged through trust, courage, and the quiet power of choosing each other. And in that world, they had found everything they had ever needed.